Today, I'm going to justify at least a timeline, which is part of the justification for this idea of the Age of Gnosis. Modernity, not a good frame. Age of Gnosis, where the world is flattened into propositions, which are thought of as knowledge and the highest value. So what really happened historically, we'll say timeline-wise, to justify this idea of the change over from medieval society to the quote modern society. I've covered in a video elsewhere, which I'll link here, this modernity idea and why I think it's bunk and you really can't use that term. Right? I have a full justification for that. Hasn't really been questioned so far, so I'm feeling pretty good about it. So what do we want to use instead? Well, I want to use the Age of Gnosis. This idea of knowledge is this highest value, and the knowledge is conveyed as propositions. And I think we can just use a quick timeline here to show you when and why that happened, all at the same time. So effectively, you have to think about what's going on in the 1500s. And I know it's a little bit tricky to go, we'll say, that far back. Everybody wants to go back to the so-called Enlightenment, which I have other problems with in terms of characterization. But really, we need to think about what's happening in the world in terms of what matters. What matters to people most, by definition, is called a religion. Okay? That's what matters. This idea of the West is really just a crumbled idea of Christendom. A lot of the Western ideals are just United States ideals or American ideals explicitly. Free speech is not a European or an English concept at all. Didn't happen there. That's why they don't have it now. It's not that hard. They never had it. They're not going to get it. Not going to happen. And maybe there's reasons for that, and maybe they're good ones. I'm not going to debate free speech here, right? So this Protestantism takes over pretty much everything at some point. And the main way that it does this is by the corruption of King Henry VIII. But let me just put this into a more understandable story that starts with the tree. We'll call it the tree of culture. From the tree of culture, a man named William Tyndale, who's watching quite closely the goings-on in Germany at this time by Martin Luther, decides to write a book. And this book is a very strange book. He doesn't seem to have the authority to translate the Bible, and he doesn't seem to have the authority to write a book about the obedience of a Christian man and how Christian rulers ought to govern, which is the short form of the title, maybe not the shortest, because I think that second half is important too. So this priest presumes to tell Christian rulers how to govern. The good news about this is governance is the issue. Governance can be done by a king. It can be done by a parliament, although poorly, apparently. It can be done by other means. But governance is really what we're talking about. A lot of people use the term politics. Bad language. Politics is not a good frame at all. Governance is really what we should be discussing. So William Tyndale writes this book. This book gets into the hands of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn gets the book into the hands of King Henry VIII. So the book, in this case, is sort of like something that Anne Boleyn consumes. And then when she's done consuming this book, which is the obedience of a Christian man and how Christian rulers ought to govern, she also has Henry VIII consume the book. Maybe this story sounds familiar. I think I've heard it somewhere before. And one of the tenets of the book, in fact, the main tenet, is the supreme authority of Scripture. And this from a guy who translated the Bible into English. How interesting. So his translation is supposed to be the supreme authority not the church, not the Pope, not the bishops. The authority is supposed to come right from his book. That's significant. So we've taken this large structure, this large hierarchical structure called the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and we've said, we don't need that authority. The authority we need is from a single book. That's basically what he does. That's the poison that was consumed by Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So now that you understand that little detail, Henry breaks with the church in 1538, roughly, right? The English king is beheaded in 1649, thereabouts. That's pretty significant. We've talked about that elsewhere. I had a little chat with Adam about that and why that's significant. And then the French king gets beheaded, like 140 years later or something, during the French Revolution. These are all the same pattern, the same movement, and the same thread for the Age of Gnosis. That is the beginning of the Age of Gnosis, and it just keeps getting worse. It goes from removing the divine church from basically everything in England, and then that idea spreading to France, and then more beheadings. And when Henry, after he consumes this tome, he's sacking the monasteries. One of the many things monasteries do, many, many things, right? They're very useful local utilities, right? One of the things the monasteries did was educate people. So that education is removed. It's removed. The higher education system in England in particular is removed entirely. And after Henry's done sacking the monasteries, he has to put that back. You still need higher education. And it's not like there weren't education systems that weren't the monastery, but there really weren't a lot of them. So he founds Trinity College in Cambridge. And that's 1546. And the thing is that many of the people that go on to teach at Trinity College Cambridge were at the White Horse Tavern with Tyndale, reading those German ideas. So now we have this rough, basic outline for what's going on. We have a usurpation of the mission of these colleges or universities at the time. So originally, it turns out that really they only taught four things. They taught something called religion, which they would have called divinity, right? We would call it religion. Or nowadays we might call it theology and religious studies, which would probably call it divinity. That's a way better word, just saying. Medicine or physic, right? Which is health sciences, right? Or nowadays medicine. Law, which is civil and canon law to them. They would have said civil and canon law, which we now call legal studies, right? And then arts, which they called liberal arts. Oh, really? We still have liberal arts. Oh, but the modern equivalent is humanities and sciences. Aha. Right. And those have been split apart. So over time, we have this well-structured, well-formed, quite reasonable, I would say perfectly named, perfect labels, right? System of higher education that gets divorced from the church via the destruction of the monasteries, where some of this stuff was taught and formed and drawn from. And then over time that corrupts into what we have now, which is a mess. Right? Maybe you haven't seen my video on the fall of the Fourth Estate. Not the fall of the Fourth Estate, sorry. The Crumbling of Academia, right? So academia has crumbled completely now. Henry VIII started the ball rolling, and now it's all gone. That's a good way to look at it. And the reason why we're so big on propositions, on conversation will save the world, on negotiation, on treaties, which is what caused the Great War. Both acts were caused by treaties. Treaties are just written words on a page. Right. With forced agreement by signature. That's what a treaty is. Very flat, by the way. Paper is flat, as it turns out. And the words written on it are also flat, or printed on it. Also flat, very flat. So once you kind of understand that, you can see this flattening of the world. Oh, everything's flattened down to scripture without a hierarchical church. Everything's flattened down to one translation, roughly speaking, although many more would emerge. This is the Protestant splitting that happens, right? Everything's flattened out to, well, how do countries interact? They're no longer intermarried. They can no longer do direct negotiation through family lines, right? Because governance has changed away from monarchy and into complete and utter nonsensical chaos, with the possible exception of the United States. Maybe I'm a little biased. Also, longest lasting government, at least since the fall of Rome. Not a bad deal. What does this mean? Well, I think it means the Age of Gnosis is clear. We have been worshiping, rather than a system of distributed cognition through time with a set structure that changes very slowly and in a very reasonable and methodical way. We've traded all that out, and now we're listening to a book. And what that makes room for, because you got one translation, you have two translations, 10 translations, because that already happened. We know that happened, right? And then your focus on the same translation and different focus, right? That's the Protestant splitting again. And to switching books. And I've talked about this elsewhere. I'll link that here, right? So now we're in the battle of the two books. We've already revered books too much, words too much, propositions too much. That's that propositional tyranny that Dr. John Vervaeke used to talk about. I don't know if he still does. We've traded one book for another book. So the new book on the scene, the new Protestant Bible, if you will, is called The Origin of Species, which apparently science mistakes for the origin of life or the origin of being or something. And they use that, which is merely a justification for a biology, for an ontology of biology, for a book about the creation of life, which it is most certainly not. And that's how I think you can tell we're stuck in the Age of Gnosis. Why are we having this battle? Why are people saying that science and religion are at odds with one another when obviously religion came first, is bigger and bore science? It seemed like they could be at odds with one another. And maybe we can't be healthy when the child of religion is fighting with its parents. That might be worth thinking about. But I think that's where we are. And it's interesting too that it turns out many of the reformers that were hanging out with Tyndale, were trained with Tyndale, ended up revolutionizing the study of divinity at Trinity College, Cambridge. So you can see that infestation clearly happened. And, takes a little bit of work, takes some research. You have to know what you're looking for, but that's what I'm here for. That's why I did this, right? I did a little bit of research. I figured out the rest of the pieces. I had a bunch of pieces. I needed a bunch more, and now I have them. And I think this timeline fits really nicely with the breakdown, with the transition that everybody's calling modernity, or some people are calling it the Enlightenment. It's not. It goes back to the 1500s. It goes back right to Henry VIII and Martin Luther and William Tyndale. That's where it goes back to. And once you sort of understand that, once you get to appreciate that, I think what's happening now can make more sense for you, because that fracture away from Christendom, away from the Catholic Church, is still playing out. And maybe it culminates for the Catholics with the mistake of making a change called Vatican II, and that change getting out of control beyond anybody's wildest imaginations of how people would interpret that. Maybe that Vatican II wasn't so bad, but Once you open the door to change, you don't know what's going to sneak in. You don't know what was waiting at the door, which I think is more important. I don't think the Catholics saw what was waiting at the door, and then they opened it a little bit, and wham, not good things happened. The question might be, where do we go from here, or what do we do about it? And I'm not going to address that here. I need this to sink in with you and with everybody else before we can get to what are the solutions. We need to make sure that we definitely see the same problem the same way. So if you want to call it the meaning crisis, I'm okay with that terminology, obviously, right? If you want to call it the intimacy crisis, well, that's my phrase for it, right? And which leads to the meaning crisis, in my opinion. You could go either way on that, but I think it's important. That flattening of the world, super significant. I think once you see that, once you understand the historical context for it, it becomes obvious why we'd be in a meaning crisis, why intimacy is an issue, why things are collapsing the way they are, why sort of small, fashionable cultural events like the ones that sort of kicked off the 1960s had such a huge, lasting impact when in the past they would not have had such an impact. That would be my argument. Look, guys, I hope you found this helpful. I sincerely hope that you can see what it is I'm laying out here and how it works within the timeline. And yeah, I mean, I could fill this in for hours just on the research I already have. You can do your own research, maybe come to different conclusions. That's up to you. But there's a lot here. And I think the more you dig, the more you're going to find this is really important. And then we can dispense with blaming the Enlightenment when what most people are talking about are the good results of the Scottish Enlightenment, not the other Enlightenment or areas of Enlightenment thinking, just the Scots really, and how that impacted the United States, which since then has been impacting everything else. But honestly, the US is not here if the king does not get beheaded. None of that ever happens. And the king doesn't get beheaded if Henry VIII doesn't, well, probably go insane due to an injury, but more importantly, split off from the church. I think that's 100% clear. And those aren't my arguments either. Lots of other people have been making those arguments long before I came around. So I just think putting them in this pattern, in this thread, will help you to see where I'm coming from. And then maybe if we have enough people thinking about the problem this way on this time scale, with this set of events, understanding where the hierarchy broke down and started to flatten, I think that maybe we can make some real progress to figuring out what to do, what pieces to revivify and how, which I think is the only solution we're going to get. In the meantime, again, I hope you'll consider this deeply, and I want to thank you for your time, energy, and attention.